The portal's inquiry is about the future and where and how it appears in the present, right here, right now. An essential and integral part of this inquiry is about how we humans heal and develop. Today we are in conversation with Keith Witt. Keith is an integral psychotherapist and teacher and author of 15 books. He is also a martial artist. Keith conducted over 70,000 therapy sessions, wrote hundreds of blogs, and appeared on numerous podcasts, including his own, Shrink and the Pundit, and Witt and Wisdom. We want to reflect on his work and on the challenges and the opportunities for thriving in this liminal time of transition for humanity. Keith, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here, Aviv.
Well, let me ask first, what is the portal you are in right now? What are you working on and writing about at this time?
Two things. One is I finished a manuscript a couple of months ago, Trauma into Transcendence, the 4 stages of trauma work. And I'm deciding what to do with it. The publisher couldn't publish it at the very end. And so I think I might publish it on my website. So I'm in the process of doing that. And the other thing I'm doing is I have an awful lot of content, as you just pointed out. And so I'm rearranging my website to give it all away. I'm organizing it so that people can have access to any of my lectures or my books or my classes and so on. And so when we finish it, it should be a couple of months, people should be able to have access to all my work.
So in essence, you're integrating the transition into a legacy phase and continuing to be generative and creative all at the same time.
Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that I've been called to do for a number of years now.
Well, so let's focus first on this last body of work, Trauma into Transcendence. What is the core teaching of this work?
Anybody who does psychotherapy works with trauma. And there's been wonderful systems generated in the last 30 years for treating trauma, normalizing it, studying it, and so on. A lot of neurobiology research. And I study a lot. It's one of the pleasures of my life to study systems. And I practice a lot of therapy. And I realized that the field didn't realize that the trauma work proceeds through 4 stages. People intuitively understood it. If you talk to anybody in the field, say you talk to Bessel van der Kolk or talk to Francine Shapiro, some of those people, if you teased it out, they would basically end up talking about these 4 stages. And I felt like an integral understanding of those 4 stages was important for psychotherapists because the principles are different in different stages. For instance, in the first stage of being able to talk comfortably about the trauma, it's useful to focus on traumatic memories and experiences as they intrude in the present moment until you can talk comfortably with a caring person about it. But in the third stage of trauma work, when you're moving forward with your life and you occasionally have intrusive thoughts or images, it's better to focus away from the thoughts and images and into states that are preferable states. And it just depends on any given moment in a session, what emphasis you're giving. You're emphasizing one stage or another. Just like grief, they happen all at once, but there's an emphasis on one or another in any given session. And as a psychotherapist, it's very useful to know that, to be able to see those perspectives. Just like an integral understanding gives you many perspectives on looking at what states people are in, what types they are, what levels of development they are, whether they're speaking from interior experience or exterior objective experience, those perspectives give you more room to maneuver as a psychotherapist and as somebody that is waking up to the world as we all are throughout our lives. It gives us more capacity to wake up to the world. And so that's the trauma into transcendence. Now let me describe the 4 stages so that
Please, let's go through them one by one and instantiate them.
So the first stage of trauma work is recognizing that I have a problem.
I think you call that first stage face trauma.
Facing trauma, yeah. And it's helpful to understand that the way that trauma and resilience work is there are memory systems. Trauma is a memory system where something happens or a series of things happened that cause us to be more sensitized, which means certain cues have more exaggerated distress response. That's called sensitization. Resilience is different. Resilience is we meet a problem and we deal with the problem. And as we deal with the problem, we get stronger. It takes more of a stimulus to get a distress response. And you see that kind of learning everywhere, martial arts, training, but also all in medicine. I had a client once, her first year in medical school, she almost passed out when she saw the blood in one of the rooms. Okay, well, this is 6 years later. She is indifferent to blood in a room at this point. Why? She became resilient in that area rather than sensitized. So the first thing is I have a problem. Let's talk about it with a person until I can talk comfortably through the problem, face the trauma. I can talk through how it manifests in the present moment. And if I'm aware of where it came from, traumatic events, I can talk about those traumatic events without having too much distress or negative arousal. That's the first stage. Sometimes go on.
So the benefit in realizing that both trauma and resilience are memory systems is once we realize that, we understand that we can create new memories and or rescript memories, which you refer to in the later stages. But is that the benefit in framing that as memory system, or is there more to it?
The benefit is that we're dealing with neurobiological reality of what it is. Most of psychotherapy in the 20th century, particularly the non-behavioral ones, the non-cognitive ones, were metaphoric systems. Carl Jung talked about shadow, for instance, when he was talking about the adaptive unconscious. You know, Freud said there's an id, which is all, you know, our stuff that we want to do. But there's no id in the brain, you know. The brain is a different system that we've studied, and now we know how it works, non-metaphorically. And so letting people know that trauma and resilience are memory systems is dealing more with the neurobiological reality as we currently understand it in 2023. And that leads to cross-validating basically every part of this work with social science, neurobiological science, and clinical science. So that's the advantage of understanding them as memory systems. And then one other advantage, there's many memory systems. There's long-term memory, there's consolidated memory, there's short-term memory, there's working memory, and I won't define all of them. But here's the cool thing about memory. If you remember an event with a little bit of the emotional charge of the event and with the meaning of the event as it means to you, your brain opens up that event to be reconsolidated. And so the next time that you remember it, you're remembering the last time you remembered it. Reconsolidating memories is how most trauma work works. The guy who wrote a book on this is Bruce Eckers about reconsolidation of memories. And apparently what happens when you do trauma work, you have Francine Shapiro did EMDR, you're looking at rhythmic movement. It activates the thalamus, which is the part of the brain that creates memories. And these trauma memories tend to be stored in the amygdala, in the limbic area, where there's exaggerated alarm. But after you elicit the memory and you do this, and there's other things called brain spotting that does it, talking about it can do it. the thalamus reactivates the memories, and then they get moved to the anterior cingulate, to a part of the brain where we remember things, but we're not alarmed by them. And so I broke my collarbone skateboarding when I was 45. It was very traumatic at the time. I'm remembering it now, it's just a funny story. Why? That memory was reconsolidated. It doesn't cause me any distress. If anything, it makes me stronger because I made some good decisions about my life after that particular mistake. And so that's the reason why it's useful to understand them as memory systems, and why facing a trauma and being able to talk comfortably, tell the story comfortably is really useful. Freud in his first paper thought that was enough to resolve trauma, but he was wrong.
So let's lead into the next stage, which I think you call adjust our life story.
Yes, we contain autobiographical narratives of our stories in our brain, mostly in our right hemisphere is where it's centered. Though the whole hemisphere thing is misunderstood. When we do stuff with our brain, we're using the whole brain, but the switching centers for different activities are in different parts of the brain in different hemispheres. So these autobiographical narratives are alive. Me as worker, me as therapist, me as husband, me as child, me as adolescent, and so on. Me as victim, and me as hero in my own heroic story. Now, I personally see every human being's life as a series of epic journeys, of heroes' journeys. And as people look into their trauma learning, most people feel diminished by their trauma learning. They feel like they've lost some aspect of themselves, some capacity in themselves, something that weakens them in some fashion. But as you go into the work, as you be able to face what went on, as you look for the meanings of what happened and the meaning of how you addressed it, more and more as you courageously go into these meanings, you're changing your experience into a hero's journey where you're called, you resist the call. I don't have to deal with this trauma. Then you take the call. Then you have to deal with the threshold guardians of fear, anxiety, depression, all those kinds of things. Then you have to go on the road of adventures, and deal with it and talk about it with people and reorganize your life according to your new understandings. And then you transform. Things change as you resolve these issues. You reconcile deep forces inside you. And then that makes you stronger and wiser. And then you're motivated to come back and heal and support and contribute. That's the hero's journey. And so as people rearrange their life story to include their trauma as part of that, it actually might be something that happened on the road of trials, an ordeal that happened on another journey that they now have to deal with. As they process in that fashion and the story changes, the story becomes a story of resilience and of transformation. And that's the second stage of working with trauma. And again, just like the first stage, sometimes the first stage is enough. People can talk about it comfortably, hey, I'm fine, but sometimes not. And sometimes the second stage is enough. I feel like my life story has altered. I feel myself being the hero in my story, and I feel how that trauma fits in, I'm fine. But sometimes that's not enough.
And you then lead into that third stage, which I think you call change habits of attention. What is the work that emerges there?
In the third stage of trauma work, you might feel resolved about the trauma. You might be able to talk about it comfortably, but you might be having intrusive ideas, thoughts, images that bother you. The example I use in the book is this guy had a secret affair for 18 months and his wife found out about it. And so for her, just the word affair, after a while, she was resolved with it. She loved him again. They were back as friends and lovers. She was trusting him more, but every once in a while, she'd have that flood of rage that thing had happened. It's a state that she didn't like. She understood it. She knew that her story of moving forward and creating a better marriage was happening, but still that would happen. And so there are lots of activities that we use where we're finding ourselves being triggered, and we notice a trigger and we send ourselves into another state. In behavioral therapy, that's called exposure and response prevention, ERP. It's a form of cognitive therapy. But also in the traditions, we call that mindfulness. We call that creating states of consciousness. You know, and in Vajrayana Buddhism, there's 32 stages, and each one has all these states that you enter. And in each state, there are feelings, there's a story, there's thoughts, there's a sense of self, and there's a capacity. And those of us like you and me who've done contemplative work for decades, we've had many of those experiences. And so the third stage is creating a new habit of when the rage comes, to send myself into a state of gratitude for the fact that my husband and I dealt so well with this and that we moved through. And now we have a marriage that is deeper as a result of this. And I have an understanding of him and myself that's deeper. Now, the emotions associated with that are not rage. They're gratitude. They're a sense of expansion. And so she practices that new state.
Can we go deeper on this for a moment? Because
of course.
Do you teach and transfer the practice as simply use the arousal, the trigger of that memory to pivot into a different state? And or do you teach, well, enter the new state and then look from the new state at the trigger to transmogrify the energetic content, almost to compassionately love the experience because of what it enabled later? Which of the above, or how else are you teaching that approach?
Both of those. When you learn how to generate a state, it's just you're learning how to generate a state. The heart math people are genius at this. And so you practice that. Say you practice a core heart math exercises, practicing gratitude or practicing a sense of divine love. So you practice that 5 or 6 times a day. And after a while, you can elicit gratitude almost at will. So then there's a trigger. Trigger is that flood of rage. Specifically about the affair in this case. Then you focus on gratitude for your and your husband's transformation. There's a book called Tiny Habits. It was written by B.J. Fogg, who's explored how to develop new habits endlessly. And what you need is you need a prompt, an action, a pretty easy action, and then you need a celebration. And so what you do, to use this as an example, I'm beginning to feel the rage. Now I'm going to go to that sense of gratitude and a new sense of a new marriage. Now I feel a little bit better. Good job, I say to myself. That's my celebration. Then I move on to whatever the next thing is.
And you also are saying that part of the practice is actually don't wait just for the trigger, build positive or transformational or desired states along your day such that you have a reservoir of easy access to travel through these pathways.
Exactly. Just for a side, one of my books is Integral Mindfulness, which we'll probably talk about.
I'm going to go through all of them.
I'm going to go through all of them. So when you are practicing awareness with acceptance and caring intent of your interior experience, you're activating circuits in your frontal cortex, particularly your right frontal cortex, that are self-regulatory circuits. If you do that daily for a month, stem cells will divide and the daughter cells become integrative neurons that hardwire circuits, self-regulatory circuits, from the cerebral cortex back to the amygdala and the hippocampus. So all contemplative work creates the neural territory to be able to self-regulate. Now, so that's an important central feature of many systems. Now, not all of them. Some people are so traumatized that they have distress. About 8% of people who learn mindfulness are distressed by it and have symptoms that make them want to stop. And so then you have to take a big step back. You got to go back to step 1. And then as you go to step 1, you look for practices that are much easier and smoother practices of self-awareness. Even if it's only, I'm just aware for 3 breaths, the breath going into my abdomen and then going out slowly. So as I do those 3 breaths, slow in and slow out, I'm increasing my heart rate variability. I'm self-regulating. I'm engaging in a mindfulness practice. So you go all the way back. And then when they get comfortable with that, you can teach them a more demanding contemplative practice. So as you develop these practices, you can use them for the third stage of trauma work, which is choosing states that are more in the present moment and more positive. Being grateful in the present moment is healthy. Happy people live longer. People who are satisfied with the world live longer. Now, interestingly, most moments of our lives, we have the opportunity to be happy and satisfied with the world, because look at us. You and I are talking to somebody that's really fun to talk to. You know, we're healthy. We're in a place where we don't have to worry about the secret police kicking in the door or a bomb falling on us. Wow, I'm kind of pretty happy and satisfied in this moment. Most of us can do that most of the time if we teach ourselves how to do it. So that's the third stage of trauma work.
So once again, for this third stage, the two pillars, so to speak, of the third stage are cultivate, I'm going to call this a neural terroir, where the preferred states can arise naturally and with ease, and practice the awareness of shifting from the undesired onset of undesired states and pivoting and building versatility and resourcefulness in that capacity.
Yes, now it's useful to remember the series unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. Every time you instantiate a state, it's more likely to come back. And after a while, what happens is your adaptive unconscious will start instantiating states for you in different situations. And if you do it enough, you'll begin to have the subjective sense of, I don't have that distress happening, I have this other state naturally showing up. Now, from a neurobiological perspective, that's not exactly what's happening. The defensive state actually is beginning, but our unconscious will regulate it before it hits conscious awareness into another state. This has been shown with some fascinating experiments with rats that maybe we can get into later, about how we never lose a response that's associated with self-protection. And trauma learning is associated with self-protection. It's our brain trying to protect us. And so those circuits need to be included and transcended in different circuits that create resilience rather than sensitization.
Included and transcendent. And that leads you then into the fourth stage, where you describe that we use trauma to enhance our personal evolution, personal development. So explain how the journey evolved there.
The fourth stage is taking into account the fact that the idea of health was wildly psychological, spiritual, relational health was wildly misunderstood in the 20th century. It's those kinds of things that make me want to write books and teach. I see something that is so apparent and so interesting, and that makes the other systems so much better, that I gotta share it. In fact, Ken Wilber once said to me, Ken Wilber who wrote 30 books on the integral system. He said, Keith, to the extent that you understand the secrets of the universe and don't share them, you suffer. And I went, God, that's so true. And so, similarly, that's why he continues to write to this day. This is why I continue to write. So the way life really works.
You just reveal that writing is a form of alleviating suffering.
Of course.
Yes.
So I could say it's a form of creating joy.
Yeah.
Creating joy alleviates suffering, by definition.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And so in the last century, it didn't take into account that we live long lives and we do better and worse going through life, and trauma happens and bad things happen and we get weaker, we get stronger, strange things show up. This morning, my wife tested positive for COVID. Okay, well, she's a pretty healthy person, but my life might be blown up if she has a horrible case of it. And then I'm going to have to adjust to that. That's a trauma, potentially. Who knows? I mean, bad things are not necessarily traumas. if you deal with a bad thing and feel stronger on the other side, then you become more resilient. And so lives are complex and they continue forward. And so we're never really completely dialed in. We get dialed in for a moment and then we get undialed in. And then what do? Well, first of all, we have to notice that we went from dialed in to not dialed in. Okay. So that involves a witness. That involves somebody in me observing me with compassion and acceptance.
Just for somebody that would not have the term dialed in, by dialed in, you mean what?
Dialed in means I feel comfortable in my life. I feel in charge of doing what I need to do, feel confident and competent, feel like my life works for me and I work for my life. My relationships are working for me and so on. It's just, I'm in harmony with my life, dialed in. Yeah, integral mindfulness, the subtitle was From Clueless to Dialed In, kind of unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. And so you need a witness. And again, all the contemplative practices basically teach compassionate self-observation. Critical self-observation is not good for you. Okay? If I walk through the world going, oh, I made another mistake. Oh, I don't look very good there. Oh, geez, Keith really screwed up there. Oh, God, that reminds me of when I made. Okay, that kind of self-observation is not good for us. Raises our cortisol levels, creates inflammation. Compassionate self-observation is different. Compassionate self-observation is from a centered place. I observe myself with acceptance and caring intent, whatever I'm doing. And if I observe myself violating a principle, say feeling shame, which is one of the reasons I wrote The Gift of Shame, is for people to better understand that. Or I observe myself feeling, getting caught in a trauma a memory or something, I can go, okay, what do I need? Do I need step 1, step 2, or step 3 on this? Maybe something arises. I get a memory of something that I hadn't had before. This tends to happen when you explore certain areas. It doesn't happen to me much anymore because you might imagine, I started therapy when I was 15 and I'm 70, almost 73 now. I mean, there's been an awful lot of going into my past. It's actually great if I discover some trauma that I couldn't remember. I'm entertained by it more now after all these years. So you observe it and then you go, okay, I know what to do. If I do need to do step 1, I'll do step 1. If I need step 2, I'll do step 2. If I need step 3, I'll do step 3. And I'll do it until I feel like I'm in harmony with the world again. And then continue. And that's that 4th stage of cultivating the compassionate witness. Contemplative practice helps us with that. And after a while, if you do it enough, you feel like you walk through the world with a wise guide, your wise self, always over your shoulder, helping you.
How do you guide people to integrate constructive self-criticism or truth-seeing inside the compassionate witness? Because somebody could say, well, it's very easy in this phase of humanity, especially at some point when we reflect on Gen Z and what they're struggling with, to go all the way to the end to taking self-compassion as a permission to avoid and escape what it is that I may need to face and confront about myself. So how do you coach about that?
So first of all, the reason I wrote Integral Mindfulness is that mindfulness enough it by itself helps. It's not enough. If I'm using compassion to hurt another person, what I think is compassion understanding to avoid a necessary risk or hurt another person, I'm lying to myself. M. Scott Peck wrote a great book called The People of the Lie once. You lie to yourself, you do violence to yourself. You lie to somebody else, you do violence to another person. And so that's not real compassion. That's a defensive state masquerading as compassion. Now, how do you learn how to distinguish between real compassion and a defensive state masquerading as a compassion? Well, you study. You find somebody who can guide you around the physiological and cognitive and behavioral aspects of defensive states and the cognitive behavioral, all that stuff, and spirit, not to mention the spiritual connections, and of true compassion, true compassionate awareness. Compassion and awareness, true compassion and awareness does not do violence to anybody. Almost without exception, if you objectify somebody and extract from them or do violence from them, you're engaged in some kind of violence. Now, some people normalize that, but if you have compassionate self-observation, you don't normalize that. It bothers you. You need to change something. And then you ask somebody for help. Why? Because we're ultra social people. We help each other. And we all have people that we ask for help. And if I'm unclear about what the issue is or what the step is, I'll find somebody I trust, talk to them about it, and they'll help me get clarity. Somebody that has compassionate understanding of me and of the world. And that's what therapists do, coaches do, consultants do, all across the world. It's one of the things that makes me hopeful about humanity, that we have this class of people that are dialed in, not just to spirituality, like the old priests and shamans and stuff, which is pretty great, but also to science, and also to modern social research, and also to vast networks of help and resources that are just over the top, incredible. And that's the impulse that we all have for self-transcendence, that all humans have to some extent, being guided by more expert hands in this age. And that's why it's a great time to be alive.
Indeed. Well, so staying just one more further inquiry with trauma. How prevalent is trauma, and how do you feel about the contrarian insight that emerged in the Rebel Wisdom conversation I've had with Alexander Boehner, where he made the observation that with postmodernity doing away with religion, the function that evil used to have in the storytelling and meaning making of religion, where that became the device we used for excuse, for explanation, for alibi, we now embraced trauma as the new device and use it to explain all our struggles and the way we are. What's your comment about that observation and how prevalent trauma is?
Well, let's just start with prevalence. It's ubiquitous. Not only is it ubiquitous, it's necessary. We do not grow well unless our ideals met and transcended. And we're not going to meet and transcend all our ideals. Some of them are going to leave us sensitized. No human being meets every ordeal and transcends it. From the mindset research by Carol Dweck, if you're not failing at something, or the mastery research in the talent code by, I forget who wrote it, the guy who studied mastery, you have to go to the place where you're making a mistake. That's the sweet spot. You're functioning, but you're occasionally making a mistake, and then that's how you grow. Well, the average person in one study by 30 had 4 traumas that could be characterized as major traumas by the DSM diagnostic manual. That's the average person, okay? And that's not to mention all what Francine Shapiro calls the little t traumas. Humiliations, a critical parent, some bad fit between your psychology and the people around you, the cultures around you, all those kinds of things. So the answer is it's ubiquitous. It's a necessary part of development. Dealing with it is a necessary part of development. Now, yes, because there's somewhat of an ascendance of postmodernism in the world, postmodernists are often called the sensitive self, okay? And when we start talking about what's called the iGen generation, the kids that were born 95 to 2010, there's an awful lot of that. And there's some good news and bad news about that. I think it's a mistake to look at the pathologies of people being overly sensitized and being taught that there's an external control rather than an internal locus of evaluation, that somehow the world is responsible to not trigger me. Okay, that's horrible training. The whole thing about trigger warnings, the whole thing about safe spaces, that's not good for people. No offense to everybody who's doing it. It's very much like the Marilyn Grossball did a whole bunch of self-esteem stuff in California in the late 70s about telling kids they were all great because they wanted to give them high self-esteem. And what that did is it just turned a lot of kids into fixed mindset kids who felt like if somebody wasn't praising me all the time, then something was wrong. Okay. So that is a pathology. But that pathology isn't driven by trauma. It's actually driven by the opposite. It's driven by people not addressing their sensitization and taking responsibility to turn it into resilience. The kids that work with me, or the adults too, for that matter, if you're sensitized in some area, great. Let's go work the steps. Let's 1, 2, 3, 4. And after a while, you don't feel weak anymore. You don't feel like, oh God, somebody's going to trigger me. You feel strong. You feel like, yeah. I get angry about this. So they have some asshole come talk at a college, some say Nazi asshole, okay? But he gets to go talk. And so kids go and scream and scream and scream, so the guy can't talk. I'm saying it's a guy because most Nazi assholes seem to be guys, but I haven't seen any studies about that. Well, first of all, I don't think most students like that. And second of all, let the guy talk. If you don't want to listen to Nazi asshole stuff, don't listen to him. If you want to disagree with him, have a conversation. And by the way, that's a whole, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about IGN. The culture now is self-organizing away from conversation and towards confrontation. Confrontation creates drama. Victims, persecutors, rescuers, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Conversation produces progress. It solves problems. So if there's somebody that's willing to have a conversation with me, great. Let's have a conversation where we're trying to influence each other in some fashion. And as we, for instance, if there was some Nazi guy who wanted to have a conversation with me, we would find common ground about some of the things that are bothering that guy. There's some real things that are bothering uneducated white guys in this country. They're being left behind in a lot of ways. And they're suffering. Their life expectancy is going down. Now, they've been sold a bill of goods about why that's happening, but it's still happening. And if somebody creates a mass formation psychosis with saying, oh, now we have somebody we can target Blacks, or we can target Jews, or we can target liberals or something, and we can attack them and that'll solve your problem. That's very exciting for somebody with that psychology. Does it help them? No, it doesn't. Does it make them less unhappy in the long run? No, but it gives them purpose and it gives them community.
So a key insight here you're offering is, number one, trauma is natural part of the experience of life. Number two, it's actually completely integral to the development journey. Number three, there are ways to work with that content to facilitate your growth. That's the essence of how we ought to embrace it. I mean, looking for a moment at my experience, my parents separated and divorced when I was nearly 6, and I was at the time still in the kibbutz, and no one in my age group was experiencing that. At the time, it was nobody separated, not in the kind of environment that I lived in. And I clearly remember, that I became aware that, number one, there were some disadvantages in this situation. And actually remember myself around age 7 telling myself a story in my own head that there were advantages. Because I now had 2 homes. I had one in the kibbutz and one in Tel Aviv. My mother went to Tel Aviv to pursue her musical career. So I, without anybody telling me, somehow found that I needed to reconstruct the way I experienced that moment in time. And literally when I travel through my life, including times of struggle and setback and health issues and financial issues, there is nothing that I can find that's really traumatic. And so I'm turning to the doctor and say, actually, I feel inside my body more or less sweetness and inner sweetness about just about everything. So is there something wrong with me, doctor, or am I in denial, or is that the example of actually processing and transforming your experience inside the context of integrating, transcending to facilitate your evolution?
Well, first of all, we're not born the same people. You know, the behaviorists in 1955 and 60 said tabula rasa. We're all born equal, and then environment shapes us. Research has proved that to be entirely, completely, and dramatically wrong. We're all born with temperaments. Every temperamental trait is 40 to 60% heritable. Some of us are born preternaturally emotionally stable, which, Aviv, might be you, okay? And those kids do well, whether they're in a horrible environment or a good environment. They find a way through. Some kids are born more emotionally reactive. I have an emotionally reactive strain in my family that came through me to my daughter, and from my mother, and from probably her mother. Now, if you have that, particularly if that emotional reactivity involves easily angered, you tend to have a lot more traumatic experiences. You will tend to evoke them from the environment. And so you have a lot more work to do developmentally. You had less to do. Is that fair? Of course not. That's just the way it works. That's just the way it works. It would have been great to be Aviv growing up through my life. I mean, I had a psychotic episode at 15 and was hospitalized for 6 weeks and given electroshock. That was very unpleasant. It would have been nice to be a stable person who could have just sailed through my adolescence without having to deal with that.
I wouldn't describe my experience as sailing. It was more on the anxious end of the continuum, right? But there was always a way. The journey property, the aspect that we are actually going through a journey was I believe earlier on a recognition that changed everything.
Also, you notice that gave you a sense of agency.
Yeah.
Even at 7.
Yeah.
A sense of agency. A sense of agency changes everything, because the essence of trauma learning is feeling like a victim, like you don't have power to do something. The essence of resilience is I have agency. In fact, Alfred Adler, who's one of the titans of the first part of the 20th century, not widely known for his treatment, his therapy, and he was a brilliant therapist. Freud said health is the ability to love and work. Alfred Adler was a relational guy. He recognized that we're an ultra-social species. He said that health is to feel a sense of agency that you can conduct your life, and feeling like the rest of the world are your comrades rather than your enemies. He said, that's health, says Alfred Adler. Not bad, not a bad definition of health. That sense of agency is super important. And you know, it's available to most of us, particularly in a free country like the United States. I still identify it as a free country. It's not quite as free as you know, but anyway, when you have some, individual rights, there are human superpowers that we all have that are staggering. Any human being accessing those superpowers and using them to love and grow will get better, will get more loving, and they will grow on whatever line they're investing in, because that's the gift of consciousness, the gift of human consciousness to every single one of us on this planet.
Well, so let's trace now to the beginning. I'm actually thinking that we might break this into 2 separate episodes. So I might actually record here a new beginning, because this was a beautiful trace through the trauma to transcendence body of work. And I want to now trace through your journey. Well, we're going to pause right here after this first part of the conversation with Dr. Keith, where we explored the journey from trauma to transcendence, and come back to part 2, where we trace through the entire body of work of Keith to learn about his journey and about the 15 books that he wrote. See you in part 2. Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.